So at this point, between 6 and 8 million years ago, we uh, we start to see some of the earliest hominins emerge. So remember, we've got the shrinking of the forests, we've got the emergence of the savanna. We're looking critically for these key features of skeletons, um, including where the foramen magnum is positioned on the skull, the shape of the pelvis, the foot, etc. So we have two fossils that date between about 6 million and 7 million years ago. And these two fossils, about 5 or 10 years ago, were still considered fossil apes. So they would have been lumped into the chapter with Gigantopithecus, Proconsul, Paralopithecus, Catalunicus. But now they are squarely with more analyses and more skeletal material. They are placed in the chapter as some of the earliest hominins. So the first is Sahelanthropus jacadensis. This is also known as Tumai. It's a 6 to 7 million year old skull that was found in northern Chad. It has a mix of both human and ape-like characteristics. And so I just want to put this bug in your ear that even all the way through Homo habilis, we're going to find that early hominins are characterized by a mix of primitive and derived traits. So, Tumai is no exception. Tumai is perhaps this first representative with this mix. So Tumai has a chimp-sized brain, about 350 cubic centimeters, has enamel, though, that is much thicker than chimpanzee enamel. And so, just as we talked about with Darwin's finches and that finch beak assignment, just as beaks change pretty quickly to help minimize feeding competition, so too do molars in early hominins. And so switching over to thicker tooth enamel means that though Sahelanthropus lived within the forest, that we've got at least the ability to start to opportunistically utilize savanna resources, that we're able to start utilizing resources that are thicker and more fibrous. And so this advantage means that maybe during the day we're starting to take some foraging trips out into the African savanna, whereas at night we come back and sleep in the forest, in the trees for safety. Sahelanthropus has heavy brow ridges and a relatively flat human-like face. We infer that Sahelanthropus jacadensis moved bipedally specifically because of where the foramen magnum is positioned in the skull. And so you see this picture of the skull on the top left. The foramen magnum is well on its way to being at the base of that skull rather than at the back of that skull. The other early hominin fossil now, and the other thing to remember with these is we're assuming that these then are ancestral to the rest of the hominin line. They very well might not be. Our evolutionary family tree is not really a tree at all, and it's better thought of as like an evolutionary family bush or like a blackberry bramble, something that has a lot of stems coming out of the ground, a lot of stems with briars on them that prickle you as you reach in there to study them, and a lot of terminal branches of places where we've got evolutionary dead ends. So these two fossils might be ancestral to later early forms of hominins like Ardipithecus and Australopithecus, or they might not be. They might be evolutionary dead ends, and there might be a yet undiscovered fossil that is sitting there as our closest, let's say, ancestor or our oldest ancestor. All right, so the second fossil is Aurora tugenensis. This is a 6 million-year-old fossil from Kenya. We've got at least five individuals represented by this species that demonstrate characteristics of upright bipedality but still retain a strong ability to climb trees. So, what are some of the features that we look for that are indicative of tree climbing? Well, it's having really long arms and really long fingers. It's also not quite having a foot that has toes that are fully in line with the rest, has big toes that are fully in line with the rest of the toes. So when we look at Aurora tugenensis, we've got incredibly long arms on a body that has a foramen magnum that's basically underneath the skull. So we have this mix of human-like and ape-like, specifically chimp-like characteristics. Auroran is a chimp-sized individual, so we're talking about between about 100 and 150 pounds. The teeth are much more like chimpanzees, and so this represents that bipedality evolves before we have a completely human-like diet with this thick, fibrous, tough vegetation. And Auroran lived after Toumai, but before Ardipithecus cadaba, which is one of the species we'll talk about on the next slide. And so we recognize them as an early hominin. Ardipithecus is the earliest, let's say, unequivocal genus of hominins. We still have a little bit of doubt about Toumai and Auroran. We've only recently started classifying them as hominins versus hominids. Ardipithecus, we've been considering hominins for quite some time. So we've got two species, Cadaba and Ramidus. I'm not going to ask that you be able to distinguish between those two species. I am more concerned with big, broad generalizations. I am more concerned with your focus on the important traits that evolve, like bipedality, like changes in the teeth, etc. So Ardipithecus cadaba dates to about 5.5 million years ago. Ardipithecus ramidus, 4.4 million years ago. One thing that's unique about ramidus is that we have almost an entire skeleton. And so Ardipithecus is starting to lose a little bit of that grasping big toe. If you look at the artist representation here, you can see that that toe is not quite in line with the rest of the toes yet. Has a pelvis that's transitional, has a foot that has no arch yet, and has really long arms and really long fingers. So Ardipithecus lived in the woodlands, kind of at the forest edge, and so may have opportunistically gone out into the savanna, but helped to demonstrate together with Auroran that that bipedality evolved first in forested areas before we ever see these creatures go out into the savanna. So a mix of moving bipedally on the ground yet still climbing into trees. After Ardipithecus comes a group that we collectively refer to as the Australopiths. The Australopiths are the dominant hominin group from about 5 to 2 million years ago. And they have two genera and multiple species. So we've got members of the genus Australopithecus. We've also got members of the genus Paranthropus. So just like it's only been about the past 5 or 10 years that we've considered Toumai and Auroran to be hominins versus hominids, it's only been about the past 5 or 10 years that we've considered Paranthropus to be a separate genus. We used to just qualify differences between what we called the robust Australopiths and the gracile Australopiths, with all of them being squarely in the same genus. So in the genus Australopithecus, we've got Australopithecus setiba, Garhi, Africanus, Afarensis, and Anamensis. In the genus Paranthropus, we've got Robustus, Boisei, and Ethiopicus. Of these, Paranthropus is not ancestral to the genus Homo. So all of the robust species within Paranthropus represent evolutionary dead ends. Of those within the genus Australopithecus, only Anamensis and Afarensis are old enough and, let's say, primitive enough that they are likely ancestors to the genus Homo. So Africanus, Garhi, Setiba, these are considered gracile Australopiths. They may have had some, let's say, relationship with the genus Homo, but may not be direct evolutionary ancestors. So as we look at our phylogenetic tree, which isn't really much of a tree, it's more of a bush, we put the state of divergence between chimps and hominins somewhere around 8 to 7 million years ago. Between 7 and 6 million years ago, we've got Toumai. Around 6 million years ago, we have Auroran, soon after Ardipithecus. The reason the lines are dotted with Toumai and Auroran is because we don't really know their genetic or evolutionary relationship to other early hominins. We're pretty reasonably sure that Ardipithecus evolves into early Australopithecus, but the Australopiths may have also evolved from Aurora tugenensis. We also may have some yet unnamed, undiscovered ancestor that represents the earliest ancestor of the Australopiths. Once we see the emergence of Australopiths, we differentiate between the gracile and the robust. The robust are evolutionary dead ends. The gracile, Garhi might be within our line of early evolution, but they may also represent evolutionary dead ends. So we're at best a bush, at worst pretty muddled and unclear. We also have a pretty recent finding. In about 2015, we see the naming of a specimen that was found in about 2012, 2013. We've got a 3.5 million year old skull that has a flattened face but retains small molars. This has been named now Kenyanthropus platyops. We're not sure where to put them. We don't know whether they represent an early Australopith. We don't know whether they are a separate kind of evolutionary branch early on in our history. And we have a much better, let's say, representative body of the Australopiths. We see this divergence early on between what we call gracile and robust Australopiths. Among the gracile Australopiths, well, among both, we see a reduction in the canine. We see a shift towards a rotary form of chewing where we're kind of moving our jaw in a circle or in an ellipse, and that doesn't really work with long canines. Yeah, we're no longer using our canines to necessarily fight as much with each other. We're also not using our canines to break into things that are unripe, and so these canines are able to be reduced. In the robust Australopiths, we see a very strong expression of the sagittal crest. So this represents chewing muscles being even more strongly developed. We see robust brow ridges among the robust Australopiths. The average brain size for a gracile Australopith, Australopithecus africanus, is about 490 cubic centimeters. So we see a little bit bigger brain size than we see among chimpanzees, with a chimp brain around 350 cubic centimeters. Paranthropus robustus, one of the robust Australopiths, has a brain size of about 540 cubic centimeters. This is not significantly different from the gracile brain size. The robust Australopiths, kind of how we compare gorillas to chimps, had a larger body size. So that increase in brain size is merely reflective of their increase in body size. Australopithecus afarensis has a brain size, an earlier Australopith, a brain size of about 430 cubic centimeters. Modern Homo sapiens have a brain size of about 1350 cubic centimeters. So we're starting to see a gradual increase in brain size, though not a really big evolutionary jump. Australopiths are firmly established as tool users, particularly later representatives of the species. So as we talk about the emergence of stone tool use, we've got to look at what we call, well, first we've got to determine when and where it emerges, but we also have to look at what we call tool making traditions. So some of the earliest evidence for stone tool use dates back to about 3.4 million years ago, with some bone fragments that were found in Dakika, Ethiopia. We've got some bones that date to 3.4 million years that have both cut marks and tooth marks on them. Now, when we think about what's going to leave tooth marks on hunted game, it's going to be predators. It's going to be species like lions and hyenas and such. It's going to be mainly large cats. Whereas cut marks from stone tools are going to be put in place by fossil hominins. So to determine who killed those animals, who was the actual hunter versus who was the scavenger, we have to look at how those marks are superimposed upon one another. So if the tooth marks come first and then the cut marks overlay those tooth marks, that means that the hominins were only scavenging kills of other predators. If the cut marks come first and the tooth marks overlay those cut marks, that means that other predators scavenged hominin kills. So for these earliest bones with cut marks, these cut marks clearly are laid on top of tooth marks. So at 3.4 million years ago, we were not hunting, we were scavenging kills from other predators. Now, the problem with these bone fragments is that we don't have a skull that's associated with them, or we don't have hominin fossils associated with them. We also don't have the tools that were used to make those cut marks. So we just have these bone fragments that clearly show marks of hominin stone tools. In 2011, there were some artifacts that were found next to Lake Turkana almost by accident. These are from a site named Lomekwi 3. We've now got 149 Lomekwian stone artifacts. We aren't sure what species made these, though, because we don't have skulls that are right there, though that Kenyanthropus skull is within about half a kilometer. So it may be that Kenyanthropus was using these Lomekwian stone tools. It may be some other species of Australopith. These Lomekwian stone tools may represent a stage between what we see chimps doing with stone tools and what we see later Australopiths doing with stone tools. The climate of the area where they were found was shrubby woodland. These Lomekwian stone tools may have then been used to break open nuts or to pound tubers. They also may have bashed open dead logs to get at insect larvae, or they may have been used for something that we can't even imagine. But the key here is that they don't really have that cutting edge that later Oldowan tools will have, that Australopiths then used to scavenge kills out in the grasslands. So not only did bipedality likely emerge in woodlands before we moved out into the grasslands, the expanding grasslands, but tool use and tool manufacture likely emerged in the woodlands before we ever moved out into the grasslands and started scavenging other predators' kills. The tools that come after these Lomekwian tools are called Oldowan tools. Some of the earliest ones date back to the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, as far back as 2.6 million years. Oldowan tools consist of cores and also flakes that were broken off of those cores. The flakes that were broken off may be used as choppers. The core is the piece of rock from which the flakes are struck. A chopper is a tool that's made by flaking the edge of a core to form a cutting edge. So what would you use a chopper for? Well, you can use choppers to pound tubers. Before the advent of fire, or in areas where you can't make fire, one way to still eat things like sweet potatoes and yams is to pound them until the juices are released and they become softer. You can also, though, pound on bones. If there's not much meat left on the outside of the bone, what still is found inside? It's bone marrow. And so having things that are both sharp enough and hard enough to crack open bones to get at the marrow means that we've got a source of something that's high in protein, high in fat, really nutritious.